I'm in the New Forest, and the internet connection here is not good. And once every 10 minutes or so, this Zoom meeting kicks me out. So when it does, I'll just rejoin. So if I suddenly disappear, it's not that I've walked off in a huff. It's just that the internet has decided that it's worked for long enough, and it's just going to go on. So yes, I'm very pleased to be here for as long as the internet will allow me to be here.
Fingers crossed it holds up well enough to get some good questions in today then.
Yeah.
So starting off just a little bit generally then, what kind of drew you to film in the first place? What was your sort of sparking moment to say, you know what, I want to do film as my job?
Well, I mean, long before it was what I always did when I was a kid. I mean, this is kind of weird because my dad is on this call, so this is kind of slightly peculiar. So he'll start, complaining that this isn't what actually happened. My memory of it is that I always wanted to go to the cinema, and when I was young, the whole thing was, look, it's a sunny day, why don't you go to the swimming pool? Look, it's a sunny day, why don't you go to the park? Look, it's a sunny day, why don't you go and play football or do sport? And I would always go, well, Battle for the Planet of the Apes is on at the Odeon. And actually the big source of kind of annoyance was that back then, if it was an A certificate film, which most of the Planet of the Apes movies were, which I loved, you had to go with a parent. And of course, the last thing that either my mum or dad wanted to do was to sit and watch Battle for the Planet of the Apes when it was a sunny day when they could be out doing something in the real world. So it was always the thing that I wanted to do. And then I kind of got to, I'm old enough to remember that there was a time that you could go to the cinema, and if you wanted to go in to see a movie that was like, it was an A-rated movie, and you had to have an adult accompanying you, that literally what you would do is you would wait around outside the cinema until some random adult stranger agreed to walk you in. And
Could you imagine doing that nowadays?
No, I mean, it's insane. I mean, somehow this was considered to be a sensible way of policing, cinema viewing. But so I always did it. It was always the thing that I wanted to do. And we had about 4 or 5 cinemas that were in either cycling or walking or busing distance from where we grew up, which was Finchley and then Totteridge. But particularly in Finchley, there was a Hendon Odeon, there was a Golders Green Odeon, there was an Ionic, there was an ABC, there was the Rex Cinema, which became the Phoenix Cinema. I mean, all these cinemas, at any one time, you had like 8 or 9 cinemas that you could get to. And so you could pretty much spend your entire free time doing it. And that's just what I did. So I remember seeing anything that I was able to see. As long as I could get into it, I would go and see anything. It never occurred to me that it could become a job, because it was always the thing that I liked doing, and the thing that I was actively told I shouldn't be doing, because I should be out being fit. So when it actually turned out, I mean, I'll tell you this, the 2 pieces of advice that my father gave me were, stop watching all those movies and learn to talk properly. And I do think it's significant that I ended up making a living out of not learning to talk properly and not stopping watching those movies. So, whatever else advice you gave me, Dad, that was wrong.
I'm sure he's sitting there thinking, no, I gave you the right advice.
No, he's sitting there thinking, yeah, I know. What he's actually thinking is, I know he would do the opposite of what I told him to do. So therefore, it all worked out very well.
That's very true. And you mentioned in there that Battle of the Apes was sort of one of the films that you mentioned there. Was that kind of the main film that sort of sparked your love for cinema, or was it something a bit earlier than that even?
The first film I remember seeing that absolutely sparked my love for cinema was Krakatoa East of Java, which I was taken to see at a kind of very young age. And the thing that everybody knows about Krakatoa East of Java is that Krakatoa isn't east of Java, it's west of Java. So the whole movie is fundamentally wrong. But I was taken to see it, and I don't remember anything about it other than a volcano and an airship and it just being spectacular. Years later, when I was writing a book about cinema, I had often said this is the first film I remember seeing and just being knocked out by. I went back and I watched it again on video, and I hadn't seen it in 40 years. And what was astonishing was I remembered almost nothing about it except for the airship and the volcano. And when the airship and the volcano turned up, I thought, oh, well, that's great. At least I haven't made that up. That is actually in the film. I also remembered a musical sequence, and I didn't make that up either. There was a musical sequence in it. But Krakatoa East of Java was the film that made me think I could just do this forever.
Brilliant. I think there's always those films that you remember from childhood, especially the ones that make you just go, I love this. This is everything I need. So,
yeah, and then after that, it was science fiction. I mean, it was 2001 and Silent Running and Rollerball and you know the Planet of the Apes movies, the first five Planet of the Apes movies. I learned everything I know about politics from the first five Planet of the Apes movies because they really taught you everything you need to know. Planet of the Apes, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, Escape from Planet of the Apes, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, and Battle for the Planet of the Apes pretty much cover the entire political spectrum. And after that, you don't need to know anything else.
There we are. You've heard it first here, everybody. If you need to learn about politics, just watch films.
Yeah, the original ones,
The
not
original
the
ones specifically. So sort of thinking along those lines then. So obviously you mentioned that there's a few films from your childhood, and then obviously now that you're a critic, are there any films that you've sort of drastically changed your mind about over the years? So maybe that you loved at one stage, but now you can't stand, or is there anything that comes to mind?
Well, all the films that I remember loving when I was a kid. So, you know, Dougal and the Blue Cat, which I was taken to see when I was young, and I absolutely loved it. Krakatoa East of Java, Ben-Hur, um, Planet of the Apes, all the films that I loved as a kid. I've never stopped loving them, even though I might go back and watch them now and find that they're not quite as I remember. Just because, in the same way that if you hear a pop record when you're 8 or 9 or 10, it sounds more profound to you than any music you'll ever listen to. And so, you know, I'm nearly 60 now. If I hear a record by Alvin Stardust or a record by the Rubettes, it still sounds to me like the greatest pop record ever made. And that was because I was 10 when I first heard it. Um, Later on in life, there were films that I saw that I have radically changed my opinion of. So, I mean, you know, Blue Velvet is the classic case. When I first saw Blue Velvet, I hated it and I walked out of it. And I thought it was just a disgrace. And then I went back to see it a couple of years later and I realized I had been completely wrong. And that was the thing that led me to conclude that, you know, it's possible to love movies and it's possible to hate movies, but the movies that are really interesting are the movies that make you love them and hate them at the same time. And I kind of had a love-hate relationship with The Exorcist for a long time because, you know, when I was a kid, I was terrified of the idea of that film, and I wasn't allowed to see it. It was an X film. But I'm sure that having spent 5 years worrying about that film before I was actually able to go and see it, just is probably the reason now why I think it's the greatest film ever made. It's not the reason, but it's one of the reasons. But Blue Velvet was the biggest turnaround. And Steven Spielberg's AI, I didn't hate it. I thought it was rubbish when it came out. And then I interviewed Spielberg years later. I had to do an interview for the Culture Show, and Linda, my wife, who's writing about Spielberg, she said, you know, you should watch AI again. And I said, well, I don't want to watch AI again. It isn't any good. And she said, well, you know, she said the phrase she used. She said, people whose opinion I respect think it is. And I said, all right, well, you know, fine, but I don't want to watch it again. I interviewed Spielberg, and then sometime later, I sat down when she was writing about it, and I sat down and I watched it with her, and it was like I had completely missed it the first time round, and I was in floods of tears, and I thought it was just brilliant. And then the next time I interviewed Spielberg, I apologized to him. I mean, not that he would have known anyway, because I'm just, you know, I'm some irrelevant British film critic, but I said to him, look, I want to tell you that I was completely unfair to AI, and I apologize. And he said, you're only the second critic that has ever apologized to me. And the first one was Vincent Canby, who apologized to him for his review of Close Encounters. And
Wow.
what happened in real life was basically that Spielberg was being polite. But what I heard was Steven Spielberg comparing me to Vincent Canby. So, you know.
Well, let's not dwell on that one as much as we probably should. So now then, has that changed your way of reviewing? Because obviously, as a reviewer, your duty, I assume, is to watch. Do you watch the whole film, or
Oh
if
God,
it's
yes.
particularly bad, or
Yeah.
do you?
Honestly, I am astonished at the amount of people that ask me this question. It's like, would you say to a doctor, did you actually examine him, or did you just kind of, you know, did you just make it up? Or, you know, like you go to a garage, did you actually service it? Or did you just kind of rev the engine a little bit? Yes, I watch the whole film from beginning to end, which is literally the least you can do. It is true that not everyone does, but I have never met a professional critic who you know, there was, I mean, I know a couple of critics who used to fall asleep, but they would at least fall asleep in the same room as the film. I mean, the worry about it is if you review a film you haven't seen all the way through, you will have walked out or gone to the loo at exactly the moment that the alien space monkey appeared and blew up a planet. And then you don't mention that in your review because you weren't there. I mean, I have the closest I can come to this is I once saw a film that I thought was quite dull. And I think I nodded off for about 5 minutes. And when I woke up, at least one of the characters was dead, and I had no idea how. And I didn't want to ask anyone how it had happened. But no, yeah, you have to watch it from beginning to end. Otherwise, otherwise you're just going to get into trouble.
And so then, obviously, you watch it the whole way through. But what's the process of actually writing your review? How do you go about it? Do you make notes as you watch, or
Yeah.
what's your method?
Yeah, so the it's I mean it's really it's not it's very simple. You you make notes as you're watching. I mean some people have this thing about a lighty up pen, which I always think is ridiculous. You learn to write on a piece of paper by. I know this sounds really stupid, but like if I got like so say this is a pad, right? And you put your thumb on the thing and you write, and then you move your thumb down, and then you write, and then you move your thumb down. And you do that in your lap, so you can just write, and then so what you do is you write down lines that you think are quotable, or things that are interesting about the way it's lit, or something. I mean, just things that occur to you as you're watching the film. You just make a few notes. And then the first thing you need to do is when you come out of the screening, you need to try and translate the gibberish that you've written, because it'll be, it's scrawled in the dark and it was incoherent. And you try and write it into just a set of coherent notes about the film. That takes about 10 minutes afterwards. And it just means that you've got a record of, because if you see 5 films in a day, which most professional film critics do, it is possible, if you don't do that, to completely misremember things, to just completely misremember. One of the things I write down is characters' names. I know that they're in the press notes, but you'd be amazed at how often press notes get characters' names wrong. So I will write, De Niro is called Jack, Helen Mirren is called Tootie, or you know what I mean? It's like, because it's that sort of stuff. But yeah, you just scribble down notes, but you don't take your eyes off the screen, and then afterwards you just kind of decipher them into something. And then if you're writing a review, I find the best way to do it is to sit down and just write, and then try and mold it into some kind of shape. But you need to have kind of historical I mean, like, you need to know where a film came from. You need to put it in context. You need to know who directed it, whether it was a remake, whether the production shut down halfway through and it was recut, whether it's a sequel to something, whether it's connected to other movies. So that sort of stuff is the nuts and bolts thing. I mean, I've said that I think that what reviews have to do is, firstly, they have to correctly describe the film, which is harder than you'd think, because like if I said, what's the title of E.T. the extraterrestrial? And I asked all of you to write down how that title appears. Half of you would get it wrong, not because you feel, but because the punctuation in the title of E.T. the extraterrestrial is peculiar. Or, AI, artificial intelligence. How is that title written? Well, it's actually written in a very odd way. And I used to work for Sight and Sound, the monthly film bulletin. They have a thing that the title of the movie is exactly as it appears on screen. So you have to get that right. You have to describe what the film is, who made it. You have to get that stuff right. You have to broadly describe what the film is. Is it a horror movie? Is it a comedy? Is it a science fiction film? Is it a film that you think is one thing and then turns into another thing? And then you have to contextualize it with other films that people might have seen. And then after that, the last thing is kind of what you thought of it. And what you thought of it is almost the least important part of the review. But that's the trick, is that you earn the right to say what you thought of it by getting the other stuff right. So it should be that somebody could read or listen to a review, even if they completely disagree with you, and most of the time they do, they still come out knowing something about the film.
And you mentioned there about sort of the context behind the film that you're watching. Obviously, if it's a big blockbuster, or if it's like a little short film, like everyone here is involved with, and even down to the things like the budget, does that impact the review? Sort of
Yeah,
knowing those external factors.
it does, and people say that it shouldn't, but of course it does. If you watch a movie that costs $200 million and it's boring, and then you watch a short film that somebody made in their shed and it's interesting, then you go, well, of course, it's not like comparing apples and oranges. It's like comparing apples and unicorns. But the thing is, of course, you take into account the circumstances under which a film was made, even if you pretend that you don't. The most exciting thing for a film critic is to see a small, low-budget movie that does something brilliant with very limited resources. The most tedious thing for a film critic is to watch a great, big, bloated $200 million blockbuster be a bit dull. And one of the reasons it's difficult is because, editors want you to lead on the new Marvel movie. Well, I've got nothing against Marvel. I like some Marvel movies, others not so much. But we've all come out of a really expensive long film and gone, well, it's all right. And what you'd much rather do is write about some film that you saw that was made by some person you'd never heard of, who'd managed to, crowdfund the movie and had been desperate to do it for years. I mean, I'd always rather see a film that looked like it was made because the person who was making it was passionate about it, than it would look like it was made because the industry demanded that they needed a tentpole movie. So yes, of course, you take that stuff into account. Even if critics say they don't, they do, and of course they should do, because it's, if film criticism has any point at all, and I'm not entirely sure that it does, but if it does, it's probably to champion smaller films that would get just mowed down by the behemoth of the big releases otherwise. I mean, one of the best things about lockdown, and this is ironic, is that in lockdown, blockbusters stopped being released. So every week you'd review 7 or 8 movies, and they'd all be tiny, independent, foreign language, strange. We reviewed short films on the film show for the first time, because for the first time we had the space to do it. So although lockdown was terrible for cinemas and terrible for the cinema industry, it was actually quite a good time to have an odd little quirky independent film released.
So, is there anybody in particular that you can think of that you kind of watched from the sort of short film circuit? Obviously, having their short created on a very small budget to then sort of growing almost to that sort of international BAFTA-winning stage.
Well, I mean, look, okay, the obvious person is David Lynch. David Lynch started out making really, really weird little short films like The Grandmother. And then he made Eraserhead, which it took him 5 years to make. And he literally made Eraserhead in his backyard. And he made it with a team of people, but he was technically a film student, and then he wasn't, and he was doing a paper round to pay for it. And then Eraserhead became a late night cult movie success. Took a long time to get distributed. And then the next thing is David Lynch makes The Elephant Man. And then the next thing is David Lynch makes Dune. And now David Lynch is like this great. I mean, Jennifer Kent, who made The Babadook. Jennifer Kent made a brilliant short film before The Babadook, which is like a version of The Babadook, which then became The Babadook, which was one of the greatest horror movies of recent years. The film that's currently in cinemas, Philip Barantini's film Boiling Point. Philip Barantini is an actor turned filmmaker, but he made a short version of Boiling Point first. And wow. As a result of the short version of Boiling Point, he got the funding to make the feature. So a lot of the time, Lynn Ramsey is another case. I remember being in Edinburgh when Lynn Ramsey had made a couple of very early shorts, and she was just working on Ratcatcher. And she got Ratcatcher because the shorts were the thing that got her in through the door. So I mean, there's loads and loads of filmmakers, some that I've known personally and some whose careers I have known of, who came up through short films, because it's the calling card. You won't make any money out of a short film ever, but what you might do is catch somebody's attention. And I think one of the best things about the short film format is it's kind of bandit country. Somebody with a mobile phone can make an interesting short film. Michael Bay, with all the machinery in the world, probably couldn't make an interesting short film. So it is like a place where interesting ideas can flourish. And quite often, if you see a feature film nowadays that's made by an indie filmmaker, they will have their grounding will be in short films, and quite often there will be a short film version of the feature that they then went on to make. So that it is very, very common.
Brilliant. So then, thinking now a little bit about short films, then leads us on nicely. I know you've generously watched a few of the films by the filmmakers that are here this evening.
I just watched 3 films because I had said to you, look, I'd just like to get a flavour of it. Because bear in mind, I've done short film festivals and curated short film strands, and years ago, I used to present this thing on Channel 4 called the Shooting Gallery, which was a late night Channel 4 short film showcase. And I think we were an hour, sometimes we were 2 hours, and it would just be like 7 or 8 or 9 short films, and then interviews with the directors and that kind of. And the reason we did it was because it was seen to be a showcase for short films. And then I did the Shetland Film Festival, which Linda, my partner, and my wife and I co-curate. We did this thing when the Olympics happened here. We did this round the country short film relay, in which we started off with because the Shetland Film Festival started as a short film festival. It was basically a screenplay festival, which was a literary festival, and then the kids in Shetland started making short films. They had an evening in which they would show their short films. And we thought the short films were great, and they were mad, but they were great. And so we did this thing about this relay of all the way around the country, like all four corners of the country. It was the only part of the Olympiad that went to all four, corners of the country.
Wow.
We had 28 venues, and at each one you would take a film from one venue onto the next one, and then they would show the local shorts there, and then it would go on to the next one, and it would show the local shorts there. But this was now some years ago, so I haven't, and then we did the Radio 5 thing. We did the short film competition with Radio 5. So I haven't been in the short film judging arena for a good few years. So I just said, just show me a random selection of things, just so I got a kind of idea of what you're looking at. And they were great. I mean, it's, because the great thing about short films is, if you don't like this one, don't worry, there'll be another one along in a moment, and you don't have any preconceptions. So I watched a silent short, like a slapstick silent short about a guy who was, who was sick, and then I watched a short film about a guy who wanted to throw himself off a bridge, and what I mean? It was kind of great, because it's like there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and they were really interesting, and I really enjoyed doing it, and particularly because it's a bit of a funny old feature film week this week, so it was really exciting. And the best thing about it is that some of them had higher production values than others, but it didn't really matter. I mean, particularly if you're, there was, like I said, the first one I mentioned, which was like a kind of little kind of comedy silent short in the sort of Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin style with piano. Well, I love all that stuff. I mean, I'm a real sucker for that. I grew up, Dad was always a fan of Buster Keaton, and, we used to go and watch Buster Keaton movies at the Everyman. So I just love that stuff. And when if it's like 8-9 minutes long, then great, because even if you don't think you like that stuff, it's fine. It's be 8 minutes long.
Exactly. You've got plenty of time to either lump it or loathe it, or find that you did enjoy it after all. And
yeah,
part
exactly.
of our festival that I find is really interesting is that we have submissions from such a wide variety of genres.
Yeah.
And since we know that you're a big horror fan, one of the quotes we get quite a bit is "Horror's dead. Horror's run out of ideas." Is that true? What does horror need to do?
No. Well, I tell you what. I mean, my daughter is involved in. She makes short films, and she writes, and she's made about sort of 9 or 10 short films. And she said to me the other day, she was involved in something, and she said, "Dad, what's elevated horror?" And I said, I hate that term. Elevated horror is just like, it's horror, right? Horror doesn't need elevating. Horror is horror is horror. Horror is what people say. They say, like, oh, if you look at the Babadook, or you look at Under the Shadow, or you look at Relic, or you look at the Vavitch, or you look at any of that. People marketing men started calling it elevated horror. It's not elevated horror, it's horror. Horror is elevated. Horror is, probably the most primal and important of all film genres. And I mean, I don't know who's saying horror is dead. I was at Fright Fest just, not so long, a few months ago, and it was packed, and it was genius. And, we had Prano Bailey Bond's new film, Censor, which was fantastic. Incidentally, Censor started life as a short film called Nasty. And, the Soskers have got a new movie coming out, and, Relic was only last year. I think horror has never been better. I just object to the term elevated horror. It's like someone says, well, it's an action movie, but it's an intelligent action movie, because the implication is that all other action movies aren't intelligent. Elevated horror just makes me want to go, as opposed to what? As opposed to, incidentally, another person who was a short filmmaker, Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson, Peter Jackson made Bad Taste on his kitchen table, and when he went on to make Lord of the Rings, he started out making these funny little shorts, these squishy little shorts. He would make horror shorts. And he would do gore, and the way he would do gore is he said it was all in the sound effect. He'd get yogurt, and he'd squish yogurt between his hands to make the gore effects, like,
oh wow,
like this. And when they made Bad Taste, they made it over such a long period that their main actor, halfway through the shoot, converted to Christianity and decided that he didn't want to be in the film anymore. So halfway through the film, the main guy turns into somebody else, because they'd been shooting it so long that the guy wouldn't do it anymore.
Wow. So would you say that's your main pet peeve of cinema? The sort of
how long have you got?
frilly terms.
It's. I mean, it's sorry. I mean, I sound like I'm. It's just horror gets looked down on. You know, horror has always been looked down on. Actually, any film that provokes a physical response is looked down on. So comedy, if you laugh at a film, well, it's not going to win the Academy Award, is it? You know, films that win Academy Awards don't make you laugh. Films that make you go, you know, well, it's the same thing. Action movies, things that have you on the edge of your seat. Like, I mean, you know, Die Hard is a brilliant thriller. The French Connection is actually the French Connection is a bad example because the French Connection did win the Oscar for Best Film, so I've just shot myself in the foot. But you know, it's usually anything that provokes a kind of you know, a chin stroking response is considered to be brilliant, and anything that provokes a physical response is considered to be, well, a little bit degraded. And horror is, you know, the response it provokes is, you know, yuck. And I just my first love was always horror films. I mean, you know, I did my PhD on horror fiction, and I will go to my grave being grateful for all the many hours of being horrified that horror movies have given me.
So it's time to revamp the Oscars and revamp the BAFTAs.
No, it's time to dump them. They don't mean anything anymore. I mean, awards ceremonies are just such nonsense. If you thought for one moment that the best films in the world were the films that won the Oscar for Best Picture, I mean, I always say this: Citizen Kane did not win Best Picture, but Driving Miss Daisy did. Right? If you lived in a world in which Driving Miss Daisy was actually the best film out that year, you'd just say, okay, well, let's just stop cinema. It's not going to work. I mean, I don't mind Driving Miss Daisy, but in what world is that the best film that was out that year? You know, it's just not true. 2001 didn't win the Oscar for Best Picture. Do you know what won the Oscar for Best Picture the year that Citizen Kane didn't?
Go on.
No, well, the point is you don't know, do you?
No.
Because nobody knows. It's How Green Was My Valley, which is a perfectly fine film, but it's not the best film of the year. You know, it's just like, the point is it's the wrong one. It's the one that should have won, didn't. It was the one that everyone thinks it's all right. You know, Green Book, it's all right. It's not the best film of the year.
No, I think that sounds about right. So let's now sort of open up to questions from those that are with us on the call this evening. So we've got a mixture of sort of this year's finalists. We've got some of our judges. We've got some of the committee. So the first question today is going to come from Henry Fish. If you'd like to unmute Henry, if you're able to. If not, I can read your question. Yeah. Henry is one of our local finalists this year.
Yes, I saw Henry's film, I think. Henry, your film was the film about the finding the fish on the beach.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I watched it. Yeah, it's good.
Oh,
so I'm not allowed to pass judgment. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. That's crazy. That you
it kind of reminded me weirdly of Bait, actually. But you know, so anyway, so carry on.
I'm a massive fan of Bait. Upon your recommendation of it, really love that film. But yeah, my question today is, what advice do you have for a young filmmaker trying to get into the industry in its current state at the moment?
I mean, I think it's the same now as it ever was in some ways. The most important thing is to know what it is that you want to do. I mean, when you say filmmaker, do you mean specifically director, or do you mean somebody who wants to work in films?
I guess I mean specifically that sort of writer director.
Okay, so auteur. Okay, so I think that the best thing to do is to decide what it is that you want to do, and then go and do a version of it that you can show people. This is one of the reasons why short films are really useful. Nowadays, almost nobody will give a break to somebody who hasn't done anything, because nobody wants to take a risk. But what they want to do is to see some kind of proof of concept. So as I was saying before, that thing about most interesting features that I see now, there is a short film behind them. There is a version, or at least there is a proof of concept behind them, which to all intents and purposes is a short film. And so the best thing to do is to find a way of, I mean, you've done it already, you know, you've made your film. But my advice to anybody would be, find a way of making the film and scrabble whatever you can get together to do it. You know, Sam Raimi famously financed The Evil Dead through, you know, local businesses, you know, dentists and local builders financed The Evil Dead, and most of them are still living off the profits of that film now. But before Evil Dead, there was a short version of it called In the Woods, and that was entirely funded by, just local. Nowadays you have crowdfunding and that sort of thing. Get the thing made, whatever it takes, because that's the thing that will then get you in the door. And then what you need to do is, if you have a project that you're really interested in and that you want to get done, you simply have to just not take no for an answer. You need to get a producer on board. You need to get somebody on board who shares your vision. But the way to do that is to simply not take no for an answer. And I've never yet met anyone who got a feature film made quickly. Even people that you think young filmmakers, oh, wow, they got a film made in their 20s. It doesn't work like that. What happens is every feature filmmaker has got 9-10 years of making short films behind them before they suddenly become an overnight success and appear out of nowhere. And some of them go through the route of, videos or advertising. And actually, of course, that is a way in. But I prefer to think that the way in is make your short film, make it as good as you can make it a kind of indication of the singular vision that you have, and then get together something, a package that explains that you've thought about what the film you want to make is, and you've really figured it out, and most scripts are not ready for 5 years. Okay, feature film scripts do not arrive. That the version of a feature film that you write the first time will be 5 years away from something that is filmable. It's just, and what most people do is that they just get tired. They just get tired because it's tiring and demoralizing, and you have to go through. I know people who are doing this right now, who have been in rounds and rounds of funding. And the thing is, you have to just not lose sight of what you want to do. And the encouraging thing is that most people will fall by the way. So sheer perseverance will get you to the end, but you have to be really bloody minded about it. You have to decide that that's what you want to do, and you have to not give up, and you have to not be demoralized when you get every single door slammed in your face, because you will. Everyone will turn you down at least once.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark, for that. And thank you, Henry, for posing a very interesting question. Moving now over to Saffron. Saffron is one of our judges this year and last year, editor extraordinaire, and she's got a question for you.
Hi, hopefully I'm not muted anymore, am I?
No, we can hear you.
No, you're all good.
Great, fantastic. My question is, with the expansion of all of the streaming services, in your opinion, is there still a place for traditional cinema in today's world?
Yes.
Great.
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. And, for every so many years, something comes along that, in inverted commas, will kill cinema. So in the 1950s, it was television, it'll kill cinema, and then it didn't. And then in the 1980s, it was video, it'll kill cinema, and then it didn't. And then, then it's streaming, it'll kill cinema, and then it didn't. And the reason it won't do is because cinema is a thing unto itself. There are movies that are made that, can be seen either in streaming services or in cinemas, and it's up to the audience to decide where they want to see them. I mean, the Martin Scorsese's most recent film, The Irishman, I think most people probably watch that, on streaming services, but it was in cinemas. And I think what it comes down to is what the audience want. And what we have learned from lockdown is, if you take away cinemas from people for 2 years, they will come flooding back. I mean, Spider-Man: Far From Home became one of the biggest box office hits of all time. And that didn't happen coincidentally. It happened because cinemas had been shut for such a long time that people were desperate to get back into. I mean, I think it's a perfectly good film, but it's the amount of money that it took is kind of out of whack with how good it is. So there is absolutely an appetite for it. The only proviso to that is that the future is definitely simultaneous releasing. The future will be that movies will be released simultaneously in cinemas and on streaming, and the audience will decide where they want to go and see them. That won't be true of tentpole releases like Bonds and all that kind of stuff. Will still play in cinemas exclusively, but they'll play for a shorter window. I mean, I think the window on Bond was 6 weeks. Bond was still in the top 10 when it came out on Blu-ray. And that is the future. But as long as we understand that streaming isn't in competition with cinema, it's running alongside it, and it's a revenue stream. You know, Netflix originally didn't want any of their films to be seen in cinemas because every Netflix film that you see in cinema is a subscription lost. And then they realized that they were actually doing themselves out of a very viable commodity, which is that if their films weren't viewed in cinemas, they weren't really films. And that's why, you know, Roma and everything being a big Academy Awards thing, and that's why the French, incidentally, fought such a rearguard action against Netflix being at Cannes. I mean, as is kind of classic with the French, they ran so tangentially to the argument that everybody couldn't see what it was that they were doing. You know, they've got these ludicrous windows of like 18 months between cinema release and streaming release, and they were saying if it doesn't have an 18-month release, it's not a film, to which the answer is it is a film. But I do understand the underlying anxiety. It's just that you're going about it in a way which is ridiculous. And then, of course, the next year Cannes changed its mind and decided that actually they are films. But the anxiety that they were expressing was completely legitimate. The French also are very interesting because there's a quota system in France that a certain number of screens have to be filled by French-made films. And people go, well, why doesn't Britain do that? Because it would aid the British film industry. Well, if you saw the French-made films that are in those cinemas that have to show French-made films, you'd understand why you don't do it, because they're unreleasable dross, and they're only in there because they have to be. So you can't legislate for people seeing things in cinemas. But what you can do is assume that the audience is enthusiastic enough that even if something is on streaming, they will still go and see it in the cinema. And all the evidence proves that that's true. Bond was still in the top 10 when you could buy it on Blu-ray.
Great, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Saffron, for that. Moving next to Charlie Hughes, which was the silent comedy that you have seen.
Oh yeah, where's Charlie?
Hi, Mark.
Hey, Charlie. Oh yeah, that's you. Hey.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on this when you were talking about the horror genre, but I was wondering, and I hear the phrase like they don't make them like they used to, quite a lot, that kind of thing. Do you think the state of cinema nowadays is any worse than it was, say, 50 years ago?
No, I mean, absolutely not. Barry Norman said this thing, which is, you know, I mean, I grew up with Barry Norman. And I didn't grow up with him. I didn't live in my house. I grew up watching him on the television, you know. But Barry Norman said this thing that in any single year, the percentage of good and bad movies is about the same. The difference is which ones you saw. So when people say cinema is all blockbusters nowadays, you go, no, it isn't. That may be what it looks like if you run down what's playing at the multiplexes, but no, it isn't. In any one week in which there is a big multiplex blockbuster, there'll be 7 other films released that you just didn't see. And that's why I said the thing about if film criticism has any role at all, it's to alert people to the thing that they didn't see because there was a huge, you know, stupid blockbuster in the cinemas. Incidentally, stupid blockbusters can be great. I mean, Moonfall is the dumbest film I have ever seen, but I really enjoyed it. I had a really good time. But no, I don't think, I really object to the kind of, you know, oh, it's, you know, there was a golden age and now we're not in it. Yes, we are in it. There was a golden age when you couldn't see any foreign language film in a cinema unless you lived next door to the everyman. You know, I mean, people talk about the golden age of cinema, and what they mean is the golden age of Hollywood. Or the, you know, they're not talking about, I mean, there was a time when you could count on the fingers of one hand the amount of foreign language films that would play in your local cinema. And now, I mean, most multiplexes now on Fridays and Saturdays do Bollywood movies that take absolutely massive box office, and nobody covers them because they don't get press screened, but they're huge. So no, I think we're in a great period, but I think honestly, it's not that it used to be great and it isn't great now, or it used to be rubbish and it is great now. There's always been stuff there. It's just a matter of what you actually saw.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlie, for that question. Moving now over to Christian Attry, who was one of our finalists a few years ago, and he's entered quite a few years now.
Hey.
Hello, how are you?
Good,
so
thank you.
my question is, I'm currently in the process of doing my graduate film for university.
Oh, well.
It's about a boxer, kind of playing with the themes of like escapism. And I just generally wanted to ask if you had any kind of recommendations for any boxing films that you've seen that you recommend I should check out.
Did you see Paddy Considine's film about the boxer, which I think is called Journeyman?
No, I haven't seen many. I've only seen the more mainstream stuff. But I was
okay. Well, I mean, at the risk of stating the obvious, I mean, Raging Bull is kind of the top of the mountain in terms of great boxing movies. I think Paddy Considine's film is really interesting because it's about a boxer who then can't box, and it didn't get anything like the love it should have got. I think Paddy Considine's a really interesting filmmaker, and the film he made before that, Tyrannosaur, was brilliant. But he's really interesting. There's a very interesting documentary by Danny Lee. Danny Lee did a documentary about boxing movies, and he made it for the BBC. And it's almost certainly, if it's not on iPlayer, it'll be on YouTube. And Danny Lee is a real fan of boxing movies as a genre, and he made a very interesting documentary. It was kind of it's very inflected with class, which is the thing that he's kind of very, very fascinated by. But you could do a lot worse than track down Danny Lee's documentary. If you can't find it, contact him he'll be on social media, or he'll have he writes for the Financial Times, so he'll have an email address, and ask him about it. So he did a very interesting. I know that he's a really big boxing movie aficionado.
Cool, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christian. Moving now over to Uri, who's one of our finalists in the horror category this year.
Hi, Uri.
Hey, hello.
Hey.
My question is about writing fantasy films. I keep running into the problems that I create worlds with a lot of weird rules that mainly only I understand. And I look for the right place for like bringing it to the viewer. And if you, from the films you saw, know of a stage of the film that it's healthy to reveal the secrets of how does the world works, or what's going on and why?
I mean, there is a thing about the most interesting films are not necessarily the films that you understand when you watch them. The most interesting films are films that create their own world. They make sense in and of themselves, okay? And I've seen loads of films that I am really haunted by that I don't fully understand, or that maybe told their story in a strange way that never kind of really revealed itself. But I was interviewing somebody the other day, somebody quite famous who I can't now remember who it was, and I asked them, what kind of films they liked, and they said, "Well, I love the films of Ridley Scott." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because he creates worlds, He creates self-contained worlds." And I thought, okay, well, that's one form of world building. You literally build a whole world, which is what Scott does. But I've seen so many small films that create their own. There's a film called Vinyl Vert, Green Vinyl, okay? And it's a weird, I think it's Brazilian, but I may be wrong. But it's a really weird little movie. And the story is that there's a girl who her mum goes out, and her mum says to her, "When I go out, you can do anything you want in the house, but don't play the green vinyl record." And the mum goes out, and of course the kid plays the green vinyl record. And the mum comes back from work, and she's got a limb missing. Nobody says anything about it. And the next day the mum goes out, and she says, "Now, I'm going to go out, but when I'm out, don't play the green vinyl record." And she goes out and goes. So it's kind of like a weird fairy tale thing. And it does not make any sense, but it absolutely makes sense in and of itself. And the reason I love that film is I think the director understands it, even if I don't. And I would always rather watch a film that made sense to the person who made it. I think the problem is, as soon as you start worrying about whether or not the audience will understand it, you kind of, particularly in short films, you sort of end up derailing yourself. So, I mean, for a start, I'm not a filmmaker. I've never made a film in my life. I could no more make a film than fly in the air. All of you who've made films have done something that I and most other film critics could never do. But I think what you have to do is make something that feels right to you, and then just ignore whether it makes sense to anybody else. I really do think that you have to create your own world for the film. What is your film about?
I'm talking about the one I'm writing, but the one in the festival, it's a horror film about a newt that tries to eat someone's soul. And, yes.
I love it. I haven't even seen it, and I love it.
I know.
And I'll tell you, the reason I
great.
love it is
Thank
because
you.
nobody else has pitched that movie to me. It's about a newt that tries to eat someone's soul.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, now I want to see that film. And particularly since it's a short film, I want to see that film immediately after we finish doing this.
Yay. Thanks a lot. It's empowering.
It sounds great.
Brilliant. Thank you,
Okay,
Uri.
thanks a lot.
Next up is Ollie Wilson, who is one of our committee members.
Hi, Mark.
Hey.
It's very weird. I close my eyes and it feels like I'm listening to your podcast. So
yeah, imagine what it feels like for me.
I know, being at school again or something stupid like that. So one of the reasons that I love films so much is that, you know, like there are certain films that can literally change your outlook on life, like itself completely. So my question is that, has there been any films that you've watched where your perspective on the world, you know, is still changed from it?
Yeah, I mean, too many to mention. I mean, yes,
really?
absolutely. I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, Silent Running, which is one of my favorite films of all time, I saw when I was 10, 11, and it was, you know, it was the great eco tract of its time. It was, you know, man has despoiled the planet, and now the only forests that are left are up flying around in geodesic domes in space. And I remember that film being the first time I ever even thought about, you know, anything to do with the environment. And now, you know, I'm down in Cornwall a lot, and they've got the, you know, the Eden Project, which basically looks like Silent Running, and it colors everything I ever think about it. I mean, The Exorcist was really important to me. I know people dismiss it as a silly horror film, but it's really not. It's, you know, it's a film about the profound issues of life and death, and, you know, and God and the devil, and, you know, all that stuff. And you don't have to believe in any of that stuff for it to be profound and important. I mean, you know, Exorcist was really interesting to me because everyone talked about The Exorcist being a film about demonic possession. It's not a film about demonic possession. It's a film about the fear of death. And I got to know Bill Blatty, who wrote it, quite well. And I remember one day we were talking about this and that, and I said, you know, it's always struck me that the most important passage in The Exorcist is the passage when Chris MacNeil has the dream about dying. And he said, yeah, you're the first person who's ever said that that's the most, but he said, that's the first thing I wrote of the book. And so it's not that I'm a genius film critic, it's that he wrote something that struck a nerve with me. And so, you know, that film absolutely did. Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, I think, had a really profound, you know, Spirit of the Beehive did. Yeah, I mean, every film that I've loved has changed the way that I've thought about the world. Absolutely. Seventh Seal. I mean, probably Enter the Dragon, you know, I mean, ludicrously. I remember being so excited by Enter the Dragon because it was an X-rated film and we weren't meant to be in there. And there was a cinema that I used to go to that had two screens. They had a big screen upstairs and then two screens, screen 2 and screen 3, and they were joined by a single toilet. You could buy a ticket for screen 2 and then go into the toilet and come out in screen 3. And screen 3 was always showing X films, and screen 2 was always showing, like, you know, U&A films. And so you could get from one into the other. And I saw Enter the Dragon in a room full of people who can't have been more than 12, all of them. And it was a life-changing experience because we'd never seen a kung fu movie before. And it was just brilliant. It was just so exciting. So yeah, loads of films have changed the way I think about the world. And Planet of the Apes, all the Planet of the Apes movies. And I don't say that as a joke. I learned everything I know about politics from the Planet of the Apes movies.
That's got to be the main takeaway from today, is the original classics is now all we need for politics. We'll get Boris on it. Brilliant. Thank you, Ollie, for that.
Thank you.
Next up is Matthew Monclar, who was our horror winner last year.
Oh, hey, Matthew.
For The String. You just need to unmute, Matthew. Brilliant.
Fantastic, Jake. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes. Where are you from,
Perfect.
Matthew?
I'm from France, actually.
Hello. So you know what I was saying about the...
Absolutely. I was smiling the whole way through.
Okay, good.
No, well, I mean, first of all, I wanted to say, you can't imagine what it means for us low-budget aspiring filmmakers to be able to have a chat with you today, Mark. And thanks a lot, Jake, for accommodating the whole event. And my question is actually a bit of a callback to the Kermode Uncut episode on filmmakers critics, but flipped on its head. So my question is more about critic filmmakers.
Okay.
And you watch about 10 movies a week. You've been professionally reviewing films for over 30 years now. And Stephen Fry's called you one of the finest British film critics ever. So I think it's safe to say that by now you're passionate about watching movies. But this is the obvious question. Have you ever been tempted to delve into the other side of the screen? Because, well, as a Frenchman myself, I consider you to be on the same pantheon as François Truffaut. So have you ever thought, like him, to make your own Jules and Jim?
Okay.
Creating your fiction of your own.
Yeah, I'll tell you this. No, I would never make a film ever. Ever. I guarantee you, with my hand on I will never make a film because I have no talent for it whatsoever. I mean, Truffaut's an interesting case because, funnily enough, I was just doing a couple of intros for Truffaut's films for the BFI. And Truffaut is one of the very few cases in which somebody was a critic. I mean, to be honest, Truffaut was always a filmmaker. Truffaut was at Cahiers because he wanted to make films. He didn't really want to be a film critic. He wanted to be a filmmaker. I mean, Mark Cousins is another interesting case because, Mark was nominally a film critic, but he's never been a film critic, really. He's a filmmaker who happens to like talking about films. So I think that, Truffaut is the kind of perfect example of he was always a filmmaker, despite the fact that he did film reviews. I guarantee you that I could no more make a film than Fly in the Air. And if I did, you wouldn't want to watch it. The worst film I have ever seen is a straight-to-video thing called Oversexed Rug Suckers from Mars. And I guarantee you that if I had made that film, it would have been worse. And I'm kind of proud of the fact that I know that I couldn't make a film. What filmmakers do to me is like magic. It's like some kind of magic that I don't really understand. I've been on film sets, I've interviewed filmmakers, I've made making of documentaries, I've done all that stuff, but I don't really understand it. The only people that understand how films really are made are filmmakers. And I think that filmmakers and critics are different beasts. I think that critics like to watch, and I think that filmmakers like to do. And I'm perfectly happy with that. Also, I think the worst kind of film critic is the frustrated filmmaker. The person who is a film critic because they want to be a filmmaker, but they didn't make it. In the same way as the worst kind of rock journalist is the guy who was in a band that never quite made it, so decided that he'd just take it out on. I mean, the NME was full of that. When I was writing at the NME in the 1980s, we were kind of at the dog end of it, but that period during the 70s when they had some great writers, but they also had people who were in bands who thought they knew better. And that's again why I say, in a way, asking a film critic how a film could be made better is wrong. You ask another filmmaker how a film could be made better and then ask the film critic whether they like it. But film critics don't know how to make films. And I promise you, if I ever made a film, it would be the worst thing you had ever seen. It would be so toe-curlingly terrible. Some years ago, I got approached by a film company to buy the rights to a book that I had written, an autobiographical book that I had written about being a film. They wanted to buy the rights to it to make it into a screenplay, and I flatly turned them down. And they would never have made it anyway. And most things that get optioned, as you know, they don't ever get made. They just get optioned, for I don't know why, but just for the hell of it. But I said, no, really, no. Nobody wants to see this, and that's that's fine with me. So I have no talent as a filmmaker, and I'm very happy with that, because you would not want to see a film that I would make. I promise you it will be worse than anything that you could imagine.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. We'll have to put your money where your mouth is one day, Mark.
Well, it's not going to happen. So it's just never going to happen.
Brilliant. So just to finish up then on the audience questions, there's a question here from Cara, who unfortunately couldn't make it last minute, but she still wanted a question to be asked. It's a bit of a silly one. It's snog, marry, avoid, Zac Efron, Jack Howard, and Simon Mayo.
Well, I mean, Zac Efron, obviously, I'd marry. I think Zac Efron is just fabulous. Simon Mayo and I are effectively married, so that's kind of not even an option. And who was the other one? Jack Howard.
Yes, Jack Howard. Yeah.
Jack is like he's like a surrogate child. I mean, nurture is what I think would be the thing with Jack. I met Jack because my son loves Jack Howard. We were queuing to see a Star Wars movie, okay, and my son had been watching Jack Howard doing his YouTube stuff, and he thought Jack was brilliant, and so Gabriel said, Dad, that's Jack Howard, and I went, who's Jack Howard? And he went, it's Jack Howard from the YouTube. Can you introduce me to Jack Howard? And I went, yeah, all right. I mean, So I walked over to this child, and he went, you're Mark Kermode. And Gabriel went, and then, of course, Jack and I ended up working together. And now we work together. We get on really, really well. But part of the reason we do is that he is literally half my age. Like, he is literally. And so when we went to the Rotterdam Film Festival, and Linda was there, my wife, Linda. And it was like, Jack, it was like having a little child with you, because he's really excited about everything, and he can be. So, yeah, so it would be marry, and nurture.
Marry, nurture. Who needs snog, marry, and avoid? Brilliant. Well, that concludes sort of all of the questions for this evening. So a big thank you straight away to Mark. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me
this evening. It's been really enjoyable to hear a little bit about your life and your thoughts on the film industry. But this really wouldn't be possible without the support from your parents, Mark, who Victoria and Michael are on the call this evening, and they happen to be from Buntingford. So they managed to organise this for us, and we are incredibly, incredibly grateful. Thank you so much. And as well, of course, to the committee that helps put on the festival every year, Paul, Jill, Suz, Ollie, and Brett, who's not with us this evening. This festival is not possible without everybody here, and of course the filmmakers as well. So thank you ever so much for joining, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this evening, and if you do have any comments on it, please do just drop us an email.
Can you send me the Eats Your Soul film, please?
The Eat Your Soul one.
So mail or how?
You just if you can just get it to me so I can see it, because I need to see that film now.
Oh, I'll try to get away.
I will sort that for you, Uri.
Jake,
don't worry.
Can you put it up on the portal, Jake, so I can watch it?
Yeah, I will sort that for you
cool.
afterwards. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening. Take care.